Good morning, everyone. So to review from my last few sermons, if you remember, the first topic was glossophobia, and I'm still working on that one. Still get a little shaky up here. And the second one was, or I don't know if it's the second one, but the other one was procrastination, and I'm still working on that one too. And so when I saw the sermon schedule and I saw the date, I instantly thought of a topic, but the pieces were a little slower coming together to surround that topic. But God's good, and He provided that information. And I know, as Harvey's mentioned and others as well, I know that I get as much out of the sermon myself, and I think probably more than anyone else. So I learn a lot putting it together. God reveals a lot to me putting that together, and I hope that you guys get a little something out of it too. And so if you notice the date today, it is December 7th, and that's a significant date in history. It's the 83rd anniversary of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, a date that will live in infamy. And we can learn a lot from history, and so when I saw that date, I thought, I wonder if we can learn any spiritual lessons from historic history as well. And so I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at that today and see what we can learn. And as Darren Donahue, he had the sermon last week, mentioned in his sermon, things can change quickly, can't they? Sometimes just a single event can change things in so many ways that we don't even see it coming. We don't even know that's possible. And this is an example in history where one event led to a drastic change. Certainly a change in the everyday lives of Americans and a change in world events. At a personal level, many American lives were lost that day at Pearl Harbor, changing the lives of their families and friends forever and instantly. And up to this point, the United States had stayed out of World War II, which had been going on for about 2 years at this point. At least from a military perspective, they'd stayed out of it. Politically, there was some involvement with negotiations with the countries that were involved. But now, the bombing of Pearl Harbor forced the U.S. to join the war. And this had a profound effect on the outcome of the war as well. As I was reading about it, it mentioned that Winston Churchill, when he heard about the bombing, he was a little excited. I don't know the right words. I don't think he was happy about it, but if I read it correctly, he called the president later afterwards and said, well, we're all in the same boat together now, because in Europe, they'd been doing their best to kind of hold out. They were getting bombed and attacked, and they were fighting back, but they needed some help. And so when he heard this, he thought, hey, things are going to change now. We got reinforcements coming. So that was a sudden change on their behalf. And so the devastation that took place that day was tremendous. And there's a lot of information available about what happened that day and the days and months leading up to it. And I don't understand it all. I think you could spend months and probably years researching it. But I did learn a few things while reading about it, several things that I didn't know about. The most apparent one is that most of the American fleet was actually docked there at Pearl Harbor that day. I don't know the exact number of the statistics, but it was well over half of the fleet. I believe maybe 2/3. And the ships, the way that they were docked in the harbor, they were tied up close together, and they were side by side, basically in a row. And as referred to later, basically they were setting ducks. It was a perfect target, the best target you could get. And this made easy targets, obviously. And Japan's naval fleet, if I understood it correctly, they were smaller than America's fleet, and that was due to previous treaties that limited how many ships they could have, what type of ships they could have. And so this was basically the reason for their attack. If they could take out a lot of the American ships, decrease the number that the United States had, then that would level the playing field. They would stand a chance. They weren't going to have victory that day, but they would have a chance later on to have victory. But it was a very risky plan. It put Japan's entire fleet at risk as they ventured into enemy territory. And as I was reading, the U.S. and Japan had different tactics. The U.S. would send out like a carrier with a lot of support ships, but Japan, at least at that time, they sent out everything they had together. So they had multiple carriers, multiple support ships, just a tremendous firepower and resources there in one area. But like I say, at the same time, a lot of potential for damage there because it was basically everything they had. The other point is that the Americans were completely taken by surprise when the attack began, and they were unable to put up much resistance with their ships docked, tied up in a harbor, and their planes on the ground as the enemy planes came in full force. So given these circumstances, the outcome would appear pretty obvious, wouldn't it? While the destruction was great that day, it actually could have been much worse. While most of the ships in the harbor were damaged in some way, and many of them capsized or sunk, most of them were later able to be salvaged. And while it did take considerable time to bring them, get them back afloat, repair them, a lot of them were back in service during the war. And this was largely due to the fact that the harbor where they were docked was shallow. So even though they capsized and sunk, a lot of them were still above water because they settled down into the mud or they settled down on coral or rock, so they didn't sink very far. And a major target for the Japanese that day were the United States carriers, their aircraft carriers. Well, ironically, none of them were at Pearl Harbor that day, not one. They were all out in other areas on different missions, and so they remained unscathed. They weren't damaged at all. Petroleum was a valuable resource for both sides, and this was something that the Japanese were actually short on, seeing how they're a island country. This was a limited resource for them. And since everything over the years had switched to being powered by petroleum, the ships, airplanes, everything that it took to fight the war, this was something very near and dear to them. And remarkably, the oil tanks at Pearl Harbor weren't hit at all during the bombing, or at least not significantly. You can see pictures and you see rows and rows of these tanks, and they're all still there. They weren't damaged during the bombing. If they had have been, that would obviously have been a tremendous loss for the United States. The dry docks, where the ships are brought in order to work on them, and as I understand it, it's kind of like a lock on a river or something. You have a dock with three sides, the other side being a gate, I suppose, filled with water. The boats are floated into them. They close the doors, and then the water's drained out, and you have the boat in a dry dock where they can work on the bottom of the boat and everybody, at least that's the way I understand it. These weren't hurt either. There was like one floating one, kind of a temporary one that was sunk that they later retrieved, but for the most part, they weren't damaged, which made it possible to later repair the damaged ships. Once they got them back afloat, they could pull them in there and work on them. So the Japanese leader that came up with the plan to bomb Pearl Harbor, he was a risk taker. I gave you a lot of details on him, but it mentioned he liked to do handstands on the railing of the ship, and he would play card games, and he would almost provoke the other players to make him take chances and things like that. So he was all about taking risks. And obviously this plan was a risky plan, as mentioned, but the man who actually wound up leading the attack on Pearl Harbor, who was on the ship in command of all the other ships, he was the opposite. He was not a risk taker. He was actually very nervous about the whole situation, and he was afraid of a counterattack from the Americans. And his concern was, as mentioned earlier, they kind of put all their cards in one place there with all their ships being in that area. So if a counterattack did come and they lost ships, that could change the outcome of the war the other direction. So he was very nervous about this, and it even mentioned on the way over, as they're sailing towards Pearl Harbor, I believe he would wake up in the middle of the night and wake up other people and say, hey, what about this? What about that? And he was worried, what if the ships aren't there? What if they're someplace else when we get there? What if they see us coming? So he had a lot of concerns. So what that led to is, after the initial attack, there was a decision that needed to be made. So they send the aircraft out in waves, they go, they bomb, they attack, they come back to the aircraft carriers and they land. And now they have a choice. Do they refuel them and put more ammunition on them, more bombs, send them back for another attack, or do they leave? Well, there was nothing really to stop them from attacking multiple times, time and time again, and doing much more damage. But he made the decision to head for home. He said, let's get out of here. And so once they all got back after those initial attacks, they left. So had he chosen to stay, obviously the damage would have been much worse, and it may have changed the outcome of the war. And I read that the attack, it's estimated, it achieved only 20% of the potential damage that could have taken place. So less than a fourth of the damage was done that could have been done. So what's the significance of that? Well, I thought of this. We know that God is in control, and in Daniel 2:21, we read, He changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. And based on that, or in light of that, we have examples in the Bible of God intervening throughout history. The fall of Babylon, for instance. It really never should have happened, but it was prophesied years in advance that it was going to happen. Babylon was impenetrable. They had tremendous walls. They had food inside. They could outlast the enemy. But somebody left the gate open, and when they diverted the water, they marched right under the gate, and they overtook Babylon. The Israelites, throughout their conquer of Canaan, many times they went up against larger armies. And, from man's point of view, they shouldn't have won, but they did. For instance, the Battle of Jericho. The walls fell down, didn't they? And left them wide open for attack. Obviously, God intervened there. We have other examples. Gideon, there's stories of Jonathan and his sword bearer with battle. David and Goliath, that's kind of the ultimate one. You have a young man with a slingshot going up against a well-armed giant of a soldier. So obviously the winner should have been the soldier. But miraculously, God intervened and David won that battle. So we realize God's in control and he intervenes on large scales when it comes to countries, empires, battles. But he also intervenes in our personal lives. And a few weeks ago, in Ian's message, he actually shared an incident where God intervened in his personal life on his camping trip. And I think we all have a lot of stories, if we think about it, that we can look back and see where God intervened in our lives, and things maybe didn't happen the way that you would think they would. And when we may not always understand why things happen like they do, we do live in a sinful world, and sin has its consequences, but ultimately God is in control. And we have this promise in Romans 8:28 that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. And I recently heard a story that I had never heard before, and I found it very encouraging, and I'd like to share that with you. And they begin with a little interjection which fits perfectly here. Our lives are interwoven with those of angels. This is especially true of those who love God and wish to serve him faithfully as an expression of gratitude for his salvation. For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to show himself strong on behalf of those whose heart is loyal to him, 2 Chronicles 16:9. And often he mediates that strength through his angels who are always ready to do his bidding. In the early 1900s, the Hovland family moved to a farm near Eldon, Missouri. Sometime during this period, Halver had an experience that he loved to recount with awe. It was harvest time, and in those days, farmers cut their grain with a scythe. One cloudy Friday afternoon, when the grain was perfectly ripe, Mr. Fogelman, a neighbor, came over and said, "Halver, you'll have to cut your crop tomorrow, or it'll go down on you." From a farmer's standpoint, Mr. Fogelman's words made sense. For when the grain becomes overripe, the weight of the heads makes it lie down flat in the field, thus making it impossible to reap. An entire crop could be lost this way. Halver's reply was, "Well, it'll just have to go down then, Mr. Fogelman, because tomorrow's Saturday, the seventh-day Sabbath, and the fourth commandment tells us to do no work on that day. I'll trust in God and harvest my grain the next day." Fogelman's reply was, "You're crazy, man. It's cloudy now, and by tomorrow it might even rain. You'd better get an early start tomorrow morning, Sabbath or no Sabbath." But Halver remained firm in his convictions. He prayed that the storm clouds would pass over and that the ripened grain would remain standing until Sunday. His prayer was answered, and all day Sunday he worked under the hot sun, cutting swath after swath of grain with his scythe. He hardly stopped to rest, and by nightfall, instead of getting only one half the crop harvested, he was surprised to find that he had been able to cover the entire field. When he went to the house, he told his wife, Carrie, that he was very thankful to have all the crop cut and was amazed that he had been able to do so much in just one day. On Monday morning, Mr. Fogelman was back again. "Well, Halver, I see you got all your grain cut, but where did you find someone to help you on a Sunday? You know we're all strict Sunday keepers around here, and I didn't know of anyone available for hire on that day." Halver said, "What do you mean? No one helped me. I did it all by myself." Fogelman said, "Now, Halver, I've always known you as a man of your word, and you never lied to me in all the years you've lived here, so don't start now. You know good and well that it takes 2 days to cut that field of grain, And here it is, all done in one day. Now tell me, who did you get to help you? Halver again replied, no one. I'm telling you, no one helped me. By this time, Mr. Fogelman was puzzled and said, Halver, I know what I saw. There was a man who followed you all day long. He walked right behind you. I watched him from my kitchen window. He had a scythe just like yours, and when you cut a swath, he would cut a swath. When you stopped to clean your scythe, he would stop and clean his scythe. When you stopped to rest, he would stop. Halver loved to tell this story to his children and grandchildren and was always finished by reading this verse in the Bible. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him. Psalms 34:7. We know that angels are at work in this world, obviously, from stories like that where we know what's going on, but a lot of times we don't really realize what they're doing. But they are sent by God to intervene on our behalf, and no doubt there were angels there that day at Pearl Harbor doing things that we'll only find out about someday in heaven. So as bad as things were at Pearl Harbor that day, it's apparent that God intervened, or they would have been much worse, as we looked at earlier. But from a human standpoint, could anything have been done to have prevented or that would have minimized the damage and the loss of lives that took place that day? Remember, the success of the attack depended on the element of surprise. Japan had gone to great lengths to ensure a surprise attack, preparing months in advance. The date for the attack was chosen based on weather patterns. It was to take place during the time of year when weather in the area of the ocean where the Japanese fleet had to cross to get to Pearl Harbor, the weather there would be very rough and ship traffic would be scarce. It was just too risky to be sailing on those seas during that time of year. Closer to the actual date, busloads of sailors were brought to Tokyo and given tours. They were kind of paraded around town, if you will, to be seen, so that the vacancy left by the sailors who were leaving on the ships headed for Pearl Harbor wouldn't be noticed. And when it came time to leave, for the ships to leave, they staggered the departure of the naval ships from Japan, having them leave one by one, and I'm sure over various days, and then they joined up later, or rendezvoused at a different location, a remote location, so that the large armada would not be noticed leaving Japan. And even though the U.S. was not involved in the war militarily yet, relations had been strained with Japan for some time. And I even didn't write down the details, but in fact, there was a letter that was sent from President Roosevelt to Japan with emissaries and all that, saying, we've got a lot to lose if we go to battle, and urging them not to. The reply came the day after Pearl Harbor, and I think it said something like, everything's okay. So in light of this, the U.S. did take some general precautions. They knew tensions were getting high. So some of the precautions they did, one thing is they monitored Japanese airwaves, listening to what they were saying. And they noticed something. Things had changed a little bit with the habits of the radio. Their frequencies, they were changing those somewhat frequently. The codes that they were using, they were changing. So this complicated matters. Figure out one thing, now you've got to figure out what frequency are they on, what's this code like? And then they just increased traffic. There were messages that were sent basically from nobody to nobody. So just kind of cluttering the airwaves to add confusion to it. So they knew this was taking place. And the U.S. military intelligence normally knew the location of Japan's carriers, or at least the general idea where they were. They're kind of keeping an eye on them, you might say. But just days prior to the attack, they realized that they had no idea where they were at. In fact, the Pacific Fleet Intelligence Officer, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, in his December 2nd intelligence report to Admiral Kimmel, could only guess on the location of Japan's characters. In fact, he actually wrote these words in the report: unknown. Home waters? Question mark. So he was just guessing. Maybe they're in home waters? That should have been a little bit of a red flag. As mentioned earlier, most of the U.S. naval fleet was docked at Pearl Harbor. And in fact, all of their destroyer ships were there. Every single one was in the harbor that day. Given the way the things had been going with Japan, the U.S. actually expected them to attack somewhere. They just didn't know where. I believe they were thinking maybe they're going to hit the Philippines, maybe over here, didn't know where, but they did think they're probably going to attack somewhere. So in light of all these facts, I believe it could be argued that if the U.S. had taken note of the signs they were aware of, they could have done things that would have resulted in perhaps being better prepared to respond what was headed their way, and perhaps not have been taken completely by surprise that morning, or at least they would have been in a better position to respond to the attack. The following day, December 8th, Roosevelt spoke these words to Congress. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a day which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Do you ever feel like you're suddenly and deliberately attacked by Satan? That's because you are. But like the attack on Pearl Harbor, Satan planned those attacks well in advance. He did some strategic planning prior to those events. Did you feel like it was a surprise attack? These attacks are ongoing, so what can we do to be prepared and avoid being caught off guard or taken by surprise? And again, Darren Donahue, in his sermon last week, I was listening to that, and he mentioned so many things. And not only him, but I think probably most of everybody from the pulpit, Pastor Allen and Harvey, and just everybody that preaches up here talks about him too. But as I listened to his sermon last week, he just touched on so many things. There's literally no time we can cover everything now. But obviously, Bible study, prayer, and learning depend on God. And he gets a little more specific about those. So if you remember those, or if you go back and re-listen to his sermon, some really good information there reinforcing that. And I came across a quote by Ellen White, and it says, "Transgression has almost reached its limit. Confusion fills the world, and a great terror is soon to come upon human beings. The end is very near. We who know the truth should be preparing for what is soon to break upon the world as an overwhelming surprise." So we should be prepared as she urges us, and the thought came to my mind too, not only that, we should be helping others to prepare too. And I feel like the surprise is for those who don't see it coming. We don't know exactly how things are going to pan out in the end days or how they're going to take place or unravel, unfold, I should say. But we know it's coming. So I think that's where she says the surprise. A lot of the world, they don't even expect anything to happen. They just think life's going to go on like it has been. And so that's where we need to help them prepare for that day as well. 1 Peter 4:7 says, "The end of all things is at hand. Be ye therefore sober and watch unto prayer." And Ellen White comments on that verse. She says, "We are not only required to pray, but to guard the words and actions and even the thoughts to watch unto prayer." The following verse, or the next verse, 1 Peter 4:8, goes on to say, "And above all things have fervent love for one another." And this leads to another aspect of what happened that day. Missouri-born Samuel Fuqua was aboard the USS Arizona, a battleship that was heavily bombed during the first wave of the attack. The 42-year-old lieutenant commander was having breakfast when the ship's air raid sirens first sounded around 7:55 a.m. He immediately rushed up on deck, where he was knocked out cold when a bomb exploded nearby. Once he regained consciousness, Fuqua jumped to his feet and began directing firefighting operations. Moments later, another bomb detonated the ship's ammunition magazine, killing more than 1,000 men. As injured sailors poured onto the deck, Fuqua ignored gunfire from passing aircraft and calmly led efforts to evacuate the sinking ship. Fuqua was among the last to abandon the ship. He and two fellow officers then commandeered a boat and braved heavy gunfire while picking up survivors from the fire-streaked waters. Around the same time that the Arizona was being bombed, the training and target ship USS Utah was hit by 2 torpedo strikes from Japanese aircraft. The ship soon began to list, lean to one side, as water flooded into its hull. Inside the boiler room, Chief Water Tender Peter Tomick ordered his crew to abandon ship. Once he had made sure that the men had escaped, he returned to his post and secured the boilers, preventing a potential explosion that would have claimed many more lives. The USS Utah rolled over and sank just minutes later. George Walters was a civilian dockyard worker who manned a massive rolling crane positioned alongside the dry docked battleship USS Pennsylvania. So like a construction crane on tracks. When the yard came under fire, he moved his crane back and forth on its track, shielding the Pennsylvania from low-flying dive bombers and fighters. Walters even tried to use the crane's boom to swat the enemy planes out of the sky. From his vantage point in the cab of the crane, he had an excellent view of the incoming aircraft. Using the movements of the crane arm as a guide, the men on the ship were able to return fire against the enemy planes more effectively. Walters did this until a bomb exploded on the dock and he was sent to the hospital with a concussion. These men and many others did remarkable things that day in unthinkable conditions. Many of them gave their lives in order to save the lives of others, of their friends. John 15:13 says, "Greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." These men didn't choose to be in those circumstances that day. They didn't know that a battle was about to take place that December morning. When they found themselves in these life and death situations, they chose to put others first. You know, Jesus sacrificed his life for his friends, for you and for me. But he had a choice. He knew what was going to happen, and he chose to do it. He didn't have to. He could have chosen to avoid the whole situation and stay in heaven, but he didn't. He chose to come to earth by being born as an infant. He chose to live here on earth as our example. And his life on earth wasn't easy either, but he did live a sinless life. In Hebrews 4:15, speaking of Jesus, we read, "For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. And he chose to die as a sacrifice for our sins so that we wouldn't have to." December 7th, 1941 was described by Roosevelt as a day that will live in infamy. In the original draft of his speech, he used the words, "a date which will live in world history." There's another date which will live in world history. In fact, that day will be the end of world history as we know it. We won't know the exact date until it happens, but we know one day Jesus will return to this earth to take his people home. He's preparing in advance. John 14:2 says, Jesus spoke these words, "In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also." I urge you, don't be taken by surprise. We need to be preparing for that day too, today and every day. Our hymn of response is 614.